Hello, everybody. My name is Daniel Milan. I am the director of the Trinity Corporate Governance Lab, which is the new owner of the Business Ethics Speaker Series. You are very welcome to this, the final iteration of our season for 2022-23. And when we start the next one later this year, it will be under the auspices of the Trinity Corporate Governance Lab. I'm delighted to welcome colleague Ulrich Laag-Theobald, who is an associate professor at Trinity Business School. Ulrich will be the moderator of the event, and I'm going to hand over to him now to say a few words and welcome and introduce our guest speaker for this evening. So once again, welcome everybody, and Ulrich, over to you.
Thank you so much, Danielle. So it is my great privilege and a pleasure to introduce Judith Walsh, who is a professor for sustainable business, for sustainable management at the University of St. Gallen. If I'm not mistaken, it looks very much like the roof of St. Gallen in the back of you, yeah. And so Judith has published widely in Leadership Quarterly, Strategic Management Journal, Journal of Business Ethics, Organization and Environment, which I guess in this domain is also like an important journal, Journal of Management. And I think you have a very interesting background in terms of that you really came around. So just to mention some of the places where you've been. So you did your bachelor at the University of Stirling, but your master's at the University of Edinburgh, the PhD of Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, which I guess is in the US, and then have an MBA also from Singapore. And you have been also working quite a while in Singapore. So that's, I guess, also like a very interesting aspect of your CV that you came around quite a bit, I guess. And with this, a very well welcome to you, Judith, and we're happy to have you, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ulrich, for this very kind invitation, and also to Trinity and the Governance Lab. I have a few slides with me today just to structure the talk, but I promise that there are no regression tables in here, but there are some diagrams that I hope will be helpful. I'm going to focus my discussion today largely on sustainability and governance. This is also where I started with my PhD more than 20 years ago now, I must say. At the same time, towards the end of the talk, I'll talk a little bit about my second role that you see here as delegate for responsibility and sustainability at the University of St. Gallen, which is like the chief sustainability officer basically for the university. So I'm taking sort of two different roles at the university right now. Maybe starting with governance, I'm sure all of you who are interested in governance already know this definition really very well, that the normal way that we define corporate governance is that we're looking at a set of control mechanisms which corporations use, to prevent or dissuade managers from, pursuing their own interests and engaging in certain activities that are detrimental to the ultimate owner of the company, which are the shareholders. There's been a big shift since I started this 2 decades ago, because now often we don't only limit this definition to shareholders, but also to stakeholders. And I think this is where the topic of sustainability really comes in strongly, because, when we talk about businesses' engagement with the natural environment, with social topics, then we have to think beyond the shareholders typically. And not to say that the shareholders don't have any interest in this, they do, but we're kind of stretching the boundaries of the organization beyond where they have traditionally been. And so because of that shift that we've seen over the last 2 decades, we've also seen a lot of activity in sort of ESG reporting, and the interest of investors and other stakeholders in what companies are doing on sustainability. And so, the way that I see it is that in the traditional form of governance or corporate governance, we're talking more about these issues on the left here, how firms can efficiently use their resources, how can they be transparent about what they're doing, how can they generate, a return for shareholders who have invested in the companies, and then using the board typically as a sort of mechanism, at least in the Anglo-Saxon model, to bridge that gap, between what managers are doing and what the owners want. When we talk about sustainability governance, however, we talk about a whole bunch of other things here on the right, so ethical and responsible conduct towards nature, towards society and other stakeholders, also responsible use of natural resources and oversight over that, not only over their own activities, but also across the entire supply chain, right? And so with that comes really how to manage the risks attached to that, which can be not only environmental and social risks, but increasingly also financial risks, for example, with the incoming standards for the GRI about double materiality. So it's not only how companies impact climate change, it's actually also about how climate change will affect companies' bottom line, right, financially. So these are the types of things that we're thinking about. And now, traditionally in scholarly research, when we think about classic governance, we think about two types of theories. We have the agency theory, which tries to monitor this gap, right? And thinking about what can we do about aligning the interests of managers with that of shareholders. And another perspective that's very common is this resource dependence theory, which really discusses about how can connections that the board members have, bring in resources that the company depends on to reduce the amount of uncertainty in the business environment. These are great theories and they work very well. We've got lots of data, to prove that the mechanisms in place can incentivize managers to behave in certain ways. But I think what's a bit different about, sustainability and governance, we have all these other aspects that need to be thought about that don't really fit well, under these two theoretical models. There might be some things that do, but there's also a whole bunch of things like oversight of the supply chain. That isn't really an agency theory question in the classic sense. That's not necessarily a resource dependence theory question. So the question mark that I had at the very beginning of starting my research is, what does this now mean, right? If agency theory and resource dependence theory are really only there to understand the financial outcomes of the firm from a governance perspective, what theories or what explanations can we have to understand the sustainability governance? And that was a big question mark. So and we had very little research on this when I started. Not to say there was none. There were some people who had looked at the relationship between boards and sustainability, but this was really early stage work. Because not a lot was being done so much at that time. And so the big question that I came across is this one, can classic models of corporate governance or classic theories of corporate governance explain the sustainability performance of companies? And this is also with my very first major publication in SMJ, what the editor pushed us towards, to really take a so-called phenomenon-driven approach to understanding this topic, right? And so I don't know if you know much about phenomenon-driven approaches or fact-based research, but this is really research that is suited to situations where we don't really understand or know much about what's happening. And so the first thing you do is you take all the data and you look for patterns in the data. And then you try to afterwards, with the patterns that you find, to explain backwards, what is really happening. And so this is what I did, in my first strategic management journal publication. And I ran something like 156 aggressions, right? I can't remember, there were lots of them. And this complicated thing came out, right? So I looked at the classic three components of corporate governance: the owners, the boards, and the CEO, right? Incentives. And I found that, for example, for an outcome like environmental strengths, good things that companies were doing on sustainability, in this case measured through the KLD database back then, we did find some influence from, these dark arrows that you see here. So from shareholder activism, concentrated shareholders, and also when boards had a dedicated environmental committee, these seem to affect, in some way, environmental strengths. But actually all the other board variables and the classic, right, board variables that we use for financial outcomes and the classic CEO variables that we use for financial outcomes, you see these dotted lines. These were non-significant relationships, right, in the regression. So that was interesting. And the other interesting part is that what was significant often in the regressions were some kind of interaction effects, right, things that are going on in conjunction or together. And similarly, so we not only looked at strengths, good things on sustainability that companies are doing, but we also looked at concerns. Now here, actually, it was a bit more interesting. We see a lot of dark lines, especially when it came to boards. So and some contradictory information. So, you know, for example, the environmental committee, if companies had an environmental committee, they were also associated with more concerns. If you remember from the previous slide, actually the same thing was true for more strength. So there's a bit of a bifurcation that environmental committees do both, strengths and concerns. What does that mean? You know, so there's a lot of confusion and not a very clear storyline that came out, which suggested to me, okay, there's still a lot of work to be done in this space, right? And so these were some of the insights that we had, that, okay, the traditional measures that we use for measuring governance structures and mechanisms and ownership structures, maybe they're relevant to some extent, but not super relevant always to sustainability outcomes. And if they are relevant, they work in different ways than for classic or corporate governance studies, right? The other thing that was a bit confounding was, you know, interaction effects. What is the causality really here? And maybe is there something missing from this picture? Can we think about social psychological dynamics of what is actually happening with these human beings at the top of the organization that are making decisions around this, right? And so this last question in particular really interests me. You know, I like to understand how people behave, why they behave the way they behave. It's more an OB question actually than a strategy question. So of course, lots of cautioning that I shouldn't go into the OB literature because I'm a strategy scholar and all this sort of stuff. And I said, well, but this is interesting. You know, can we look at this? And so that's what we started to do. You know, slowly over my work, I started to work with also these upper echelons perspective, which take kind of the proxies, you know, measures from CEOs and boards. But I was also interested in looking a little bit deeper, right? And this is the classic thing that we call behavioral governance or behavioral sustainability governance in my case. So this is Jim Westphal and at Zajac talked about this extensively in Academy of Management Annals study about what is behavioral governance and really what are the social psychological dynamics that drive outcomes for firms in a certain way. And so that is the tension between what individuals from a psychological perspective might do, and what are the pressures that come from the outside on companies that might change that behavior, because those are the social norms, right? And so this is kind of what we increasingly also label as micro foundations, right? So micro foundations studies or behavioral strategy or behavioral governance actually looking at the same types of things. We're looking at how individuals affect organizational level outcomes. And often in the context of social norms. So you have these cross-level analysis studies, right? And so if we want to look at social norms and then say pro-environmental behavior of companies, right, there is something in the middle, like this classic black box, in this case, maybe a dark blue box, right? So what is in that box and can we unpack it? And so here I started to look a little bit at the psychology literature. You know, there's actually a fairly rapidly developing and somewhat rich literature in environmental psychology, where we understand the roles of values, emotions, awareness, you know, for individual level pro-environmental behavior. There's also some work on personality traits and other characteristics and things like cognitive processes and experience. So this literature was back then sort of starting, and it has really gained a lot of ground since then, but often was looking only at, you know, how consumers make choices about whether or not they turn the heat off at night, or, you know, reduce the amount of water they use for showers. And here I wanted to sort of bring this into more the corporate study space, right? So that was the idea. And so it started with really simple work, you know, because also when you try to do something new, it's sometimes hard to get this published and it's also hard to measure, you know, no one has really done it before. So some of these studies look really basic, you know, at things like what are the key CEO characteristics and how do they drive corporate sustainability. So here's an example of a study with Ben Lewis, Glenn Dowell, where we looked basically at backgrounds of CEOs, right? And we looked at CEOs who have MBA degrees, CEOs who have some kind of legal degree, and then whether or not CEOs were new, you know, so these three different types of CEOs. And we noticed that when it came to disclosing information on sustainability, or in this case, environmental information disclosure to the CDP, which is the Carbon Disclosure Project, which does a questionnaire, we actually saw quite a big difference in the likelihood to disclose, right? So above 1 means, you know, more than average, and below 1 is less than average. So we can see that CEOs with MBA degrees actually were much more likely to disclose than anybody else, right? Any other type of CEO. New CEOs also were more likely to disclose than CEOs that had been, you know, in their job for quite a long time, more than 2 years. But by contrast, CEOs with legal backgrounds were much less likely to disclose. And so this got us interested, you know, and the way that we position this or describe this is really that CEOs with MBA degrees are trained to think about win-win solutions, right? To seek opportunities, try to seek a value proposition from tackling a topic like sustainability. By contrast, CEOs with legal degrees are taught to mitigate risk. You know, and so they might view giving out too much information about environmental disclosure as a potential, you know, risky prospect. And so they were much likely to engage in that process. And new CEOs is actually very old theory already, that we know that CEO newness tends to bring change to companies. So also in the innovation literature, this has been described a lot. And we just wanted to verify that indeed this is also the case for something like sustainability. And that does seem to be the case. So this was one study that we started with, and then we started looking at also the question of newness more recently with Sana Chu in a different context. So now we thought, okay, it's fine. You know, we know that new CEOs bring more, you know, attention to sustainability for corporations. But what about if companies are in financial distress, right? And here we really saw a big difference, for example, on the left-hand side, that if you don't have a new CEO, so no succession, right, the presence or absence of financial distress didn't really matter. There was this, you know, level of corporate social performance in this case, so broader than environmental, but really also including the social. But of course, with new CEOs, the theory would predict that, you know, you would do more on sustainability. And this was only true if there was no financial distress for the company, right? So when the company was facing financial distress, there was actually not that much extra activity, at least not significantly different from before. We found that interesting, and then we thought, okay, well, if in the presence of financial distress, you know, and we have a CEO success, in the absence of financial distress, but we have CEO succession, great, you know, we have more sustainability, but does it matter also where this succession comes from? If it's someone who's being promoted from within, so this inside succession, or if it is a new hire from the outside, someone who doesn't know anything about the company. And what was interesting here, and a very strong effect, that if the new CEO came from outside of the company, so no previous relationship with the company's social and environmental stakeholders, they clearly prioritized the financial, you know, problem of the company and took all their efforts away from sustainability. But if the CEO was promoted from within, there seems to be this legacy issue, right? Probably this person has already dealt a lot with these stakeholders. And so there was a stronger likelihood to kind of maintain the status quo, right, on the sustainability. So that was also quite interesting for us to look at. And then with Pasquale Beuron back in 2017, we also looked a bit at the role of CEO power, right? We were interested partly to see if CEOs might have some kind of intrinsic motivation or experience type of power versus, you know, just a hierarchical formal power that you have sometimes through getting lots of titles and board positions and many people reporting into you. And specifically, we looked at how many people did the CEO hire after they joined, right? So the turnover of the executive team. So that gives the CEO more power over these new people that have joined. So here we saw that, you know, the lowest environmental footprint, so the best performance, was actually for those CEOs that had more informal power through expertise, right? So expert power is a type of informal power where, because experts are sort of held in highly regard and people trust them to do the right thing, this gives them also the power and influence to get employees on board. So here, this power through intrinsic motivation was really able to help companies do better environmentally. However, you know, even though CEOs with only formal power and not much environmental expertise, they could be motivated to take action if there was, pressure, explicit pressure from shareholders outside, that were demanding companies to do more on sustainability. So that was quite interesting for us, that in some cases it can be intrinsically driven, from the CEO's expertise. But even when the CEO doesn't have the expertise, you can still sort of give them a bit of a kick, through this external activism, which was really quite nice to see that, right? And maybe somewhat promising that things can change. So other than CEOs, we also looked a bit at board members' characteristics and what they are doing. And here's a study with Andy Hoffman from the University of Michigan, where we looked at not only the level of environmental experience that a particular board had. You would expect boards with higher environmental experience to do more on sustainability or to deviate more positively. So here we looked really at the deviation above and beyond the norm for the industry, right? So more an institutional theory perspective. And this was true. But what was also interesting for us is that those boards with lower environmental experience, they were less likely to deviate on sustainability when they were in a strong central network position, meaning that they got a lot of social norm pressure from their peers to perform a certain way. And then they didn't want to take the risk to do something outside the norm. So they would still be okay on sustainability, but they wouldn't sort of take it above and beyond, which is maybe, what we need for sustainability transformation. We need leaders, right, to really do something slightly different. So that was also interesting for us, that it was really the boards with the higher environmental experience, especially when they were more on the periphery, boards more on the periphery could seem to be able to experiment a little bit more, right, in that regard. Another study, more recent now in the context of China, was done again with board traits, but here was gender characteristics of boards. So whether or not boards had a minimum critical mass of female board directors. So in China, similar to in the US, the average board size is roughly 10 people. And so critical mass theory would say that you need at least 3 members then out of 10, like about 30% to be of a certain gender, say female, in order to have some kind of diversity, cognitive differentiation effects kicking in. And so here again, we looked at what is the situation and in general, when boards had a critical mass of female directors. Yes, there was better quality of corporate environmental actions, but particularly when there was a lot of monitoring from the government, right, from the outside. And so we just tested this both with formal monitoring mechanisms, which was through government. We had the same effect actually for informal monitoring mechanisms. So what is the community around focusing on? Are they more sort of environmentally oriented through, for example, more Buddhist religious activity going on in these places? And we saw exactly the same effect as you see here, that when the monitoring was higher from the outside, these women, really seemed to be able to maybe leverage that outside pressure to get more activity happening within the board. So that was interesting to see. And then also looked a little bit at owners. Actually, I'm not the key person that does studies here. There are many others who look at shareholder dynamics and sustainability. That space is quite full, so I stayed mostly out of it, but actually had an opportunity to work with James Coombs and Peter Jaskowitz and Rahul Ravi on the particular case of family-owned businesses, which I think is a really interesting case because family-owned businesses have something called socio-emotional wealth. Right, there's classic papers by Pasquale Baron, who's actually a co-author of mine on other papers, but he's really shown that because family businesses have very close relationship both with internal and external stakeholders, right? Relationships that are established over long periods of time where a lot of trust is placed, and understanding that, if things are sort of not going so well right now, then it will be better later on, and we will keep you as a supplier or a buyer, etc., and so on. So this social emotional wealth can be quite powerful, right, for certain outcomes. And we were interested to see, does this social emotional wealth also translate to sustainability action? And what was actually quite surprising for us, that yes, it translates, but not only does it translate in terms of financial benefits, right, for the family-owned business when the corporate sustainability activities were substantive, so not symbolic, so no greenwashing, so really substantive corporate sustainability activities. Yes, for sure. But what was nice about family businesses compared to non-family firms, they also were able to leverage symbolic CSR financially. And we think the reason for this is probably because the stakeholders understand that even if the activity is symbolic, they trust the family business enough that eventually this will be translated into something more meaningful, right? So these are the only companies that I know of that can get away with greenwashing, so to speak, so everybody else gets highly punished for greenwashing. But when you're a family business, apparently for a short period of time, say within 1 year, you can do this symbolic, signaling that you're going to be doing something. And then, hopefully later on over a longer period of time, then it translates into substantive. And if that's the case, in both cases, you actually experience a higher firm value from this, right? Yeah, so, maybe the insights from all of these studies to date really show, that these types of characteristics of CEOs, boards, and even ownership characteristics really seem to matter. And I think there's a lot more work to do in this space, to really try to understand the nuances of how this works. Because for me, it's a little bit drifting away from agency theory and resource dependence theory. These are really human theories now about psychology and sociology and the dynamics that drive these outcomes. So yeah, I think a lot more to do. And apart from this research, I do many other things as well. I'm increasingly interested in how companies manage their biodiversity footprint, and I've got several grants in works on that. I'm still interested in greenwashing, so we're actually working with a local advertising agency to study the perception of brands in Switzerland, and how green or not they are. I'm also continuing to work on micro foundations in different settings, so how emotions drive debates and polarization in contested industries, and how sustainability leaders might take their companies forward. And still, of course, climate change is very important. So climate change performance studies, like the consistency or inconsistency of target setting and different types of strategies that companies take. At the same time, trying to manage some special issues, as you can see on the right, on measurement of sustainability and impact scholarship. And actually coming out next month already is a more practitioner-oriented journal, Amplify, a special issue on business and biodiversity. So this is coming. Yeah, and of course, all the studies that I mentioned are not just done by me. There are many nice co-authors from all over the world, a very diverse set. So I want to thank them. I don't think anyone, very few people do research on their own. But maybe I should stop here and see if there are any questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Judith. That was really interesting. And what I think particularly adorable is that you really seem to have like a clear research agenda. Like I think it really kind of forms a very nice story, like all the things that you did over the years. So just as a reminder for the audience, we have this a function where you can post your questions, and if you post a question, I'm more than happy to ask it. So you can't really ask directly, but you have to post your questions in the Q&A, and then I can post them. Maybe to start this off, like what I found really fascinating, that you seem to be one of the few of us that really applies your research in some sense and not only talks about it. And I would be wondering whether you can really apply your research like in specific, or whether this like the role that you have at the university is much more, I don't know, administrative, and it's somehow like distinct from what you do in research.
Well, I think it's a little bit of both, sometimes it's, I think my research in general has some quite pragmatic implications. If we know that expertise matters, then all you need to do is hire experts, right? So, and maybe that's a bit of a no-brainer, but, no one has really looked at this closely before. And certainly our approach has been to bring in experts, right? So this is kind of one way to get movement on sustainability, to get people who really know what they're talking about. And I think this is for two reasons, not only because then you do have an expert who knows what they're doing, but it also is helpful for the rest of the faculty because number one, they can ask the expert if they're not sure, you know, and learn from that person through co-teaching or whatever. But I think number two, it also absolves them a little bit because a lot of faculty might feel very uncomfortable, you know, changing their courses a lot, and especially if they're not so comfortable with climate change. And then what I've been doing a lot is we do a lot of these workshops for faculty and also one-on-ones with faculty. So we work with individual programs, with individual faculty, with individual courses sometimes to try and help, you know, not to force them to do a sustainability, but to just point out, okay, here are some touch points where it would be a natural fit for you to bring in these three concepts, right, on sustainable finance or this aspect of sustainable consumption. And, you know, depending on what people are teaching, marketing or finance or accounting. So that is quite powerful, I think, because sometimes people only see obstacles, you know, it's like, oh, it's not possible to bring sustainability into my course because my course is a core, you know, microeconomics course for 500 bachelor students. I said, well, you know, why don't you have them calculate instead of that mathematical formula over there, you know, something on climate change or environment or biodiversity valuation, you know, I mean, there's just so many things that you can bring in, you know. Yeah.
That's very interesting. I think that also kind of resonates with recent discussions we have at Trinity Business School, like changing the curriculum in a direction that it involves more sustainability, and then not only like having an additional sustainability class, which I guess is probably not the best solution, but really trying to include this in every offering that we have in some sense. Coming back to your research, which I think is really impressive, like one thing that I kind of recognize when you kind of presented these relatively high level findings is that most of the findings you presented somehow included interaction effects, and I guess you also mentioned that at the beginning. Is that something specific to the topic of sustainability, that it seems to be like highly context depending on how it plays out?
I don't know if that's only specific to sustainability. Honestly, I think Jim Westphal does a lot of this kind of work as well, where he looks at the sociological, you know, external drivers and then the internal, you know, psychological mechanisms or cognitive mechanisms that boards or CEOs go through, or within the firm, you know, the interacting effects between what the one member on the board thinks and what the rest of the members on the board think. So it's the nature of microfoundations research. So almost all microfoundations research would look at the interaction, because by definition, you tend to have two levels of analysis, right? You're looking at the underlying foundations of something higher up. So when you cross levels of analysis, you have to have the interaction there to explain, you know, it can't just be a direct effect. There's something from the outside there as well. But I do think that you know, what's important in sustainability is to acknowledge the complexity and the nuance. It's just very hard I mean, I just don't think that there are any silver bullets in this, right? So it's not like a plug and play. We have one solution and we apply it. That's certainly not the case. You know, in my extensive contact now with executives and board members through our university teaching, it's clear that board members by and large don't understand much about sustainability. They just completely lack the expertise, and what they do know is simply either very high level or what an investor has told them, you know, this thing is important, and so then they focus on that thing. But then I try to explain to them, okay, well, if you think this thing is important, you have to consider all these other factors at the same time that interact with this thing, you know. And so it's a little bit that, you know, I think that balancing act. And because sustainability still very much, you know, for any kind of business also has to have a profit story, right, in the end. I mean, I can't imagine that we would ask companies to be completely altruistic in this purpose, right? I mean, the business won't survive if it also can't survive financially. So, I mean, I think in the short term, companies can take a temporary, investment hit, if you like investing into something new, but this can't last forever. They have to see some benefit at the end of the day and some value creation opportunity for, whether even if the product has a longer life, how do you finance that? What's the model behind that? And I think so there the complexity also comes in for people, right? You're no longer just thinking in one direction, which is the profit. You're actually now starting to juggle multiple things and bring in the Ukraine war and other things. I mean, supply chain disruptions because of COVID, and then you quickly start to get a very complex map.
Yeah, I can imagine. Like another thing I find quite interesting is my background it sits at the intersection between OB and business ethics.
Mm-hmm.
And so my very preliminary sense is that those business ethics folks and sustainability people don't talk too much to each other. So like oftentimes people would draw this kind of topic related connection that there must be some link between the two. But at the same time, I think there's not much really that these communities talk to each other. So one thing I would find interesting from a business ethics perspective, whether your work would also have implication for kind of ethical questions, or like whether you can imagine like research also maybe at this micro foundation level that also has kind of ethical implications.
Absolutely. I mean, I know a very limited amount about ethics, so I hesitate to prescribe what you guys should research. But, I mean, of course, ethics are very individual, right? I mean, this is clear from my study on emotions and contested industry. So I went to Africa to study trophy hunting and the debate around trophy hunting. And if you're in the UK, you know that this has been in the news a lot, or maybe also Ireland. I guess I sort of mix you guys in there. This is highly emotional issue, and we looked a little bit at sort of what's driving that polarization, and is there some way to get back, to having a dialogue? What we haven't really talked about in our preliminary results, but what's definitely evident in our data, which is qualitative data, is that everybody defines their own version of ethical hunting. Right. And those who are against trophy hunting take a really strong stance that hunting can never be ethical. Right. And so you have the different, I forget all the names of different types of ethics, but, these are different views on ethics. Right. And if that's the case, right, if every individual has their own version of what is ethical or what's not ethical, for sure, this comes into sustainability because you have the complexity of the problems. What would you do if you have to trade off reducing your carbon emissions, but then you're losing jobs over here, right? Or, I mean, many of these kinds of questions, your supply chain, is it more important to get your suppliers to comply again, with environmental topics, or do you care about child labor because, you've got 4-year-olds working in a mine? I mean, this then comes to the question of what is prioritized. And in the classic global reporting, initiative, we have this wonderful materiality matrix, and then usually the topics that come in the top right are things like climate and packaging and whatever. But the human aspect is an important aspect as well, right? And how do we balance that? And yeah, I think it's not super clear. And in the end, maybe people have to take a stance one way or another, or decide.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah,
I think that's also like a discussion that is described like well in the business ethics literature, that there's like an increasing kind of moralization in the sense that everybody would have an opinion on what is going on in the organization. And so it becomes quite impactful for the organizations, whether how they're perceived like on a moral level. And I think sustainability is kind of one case in time of where people think in kind of moral terms of how companies behave. The other thing I found quite interesting in your discussion is that apparently in the sustainability literature, there is like a natural tendency that you will look for some kind of win-win situation, because in the end you kind of have to sell this to the manager, right? Because otherwise they don't do it. And that's apparently like a difference also to business ethics, because last year we had like a friend, Brian Berkey, over at the Institute for Business Ethics in St. Gallen, and he would present a paper, for example, about why it's important for business ethicists to, I don't know, like really emphasize aspects that no manager never ever will do, but still we have to kind of like emphasize this, and that this would be nice to do. And so I wonder, like, if you would have no constraints in the sense that you would have to persuade managers, like what would be the questions that business that sustainability management scholars would ask if there would be not this limitation?
Yeah. I mean, there's been some discussion in the scholarly literature on this. I think it's Christopher Wright and Nyberg, who pointed out quite critically that every business scholar study on sustainability is somehow wrong, right, ethically. And like, you know, first there are the denialist people who sort of claim climate change doesn't exist. Okay, that's one problem. And then there are the people who agree it exists but don't do anything, right? That's a second problem. And then there are those of us like me who say there's a win-win solution, you know, to kind of turn it into this strategic opportunity. And they say that's maybe even the biggest problem, because, you know, we are forgetting about what is the very fundamental foundation of life, and what we need to do is reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And, you know, there's sort of a moral obligation behind all of this. And I do think, you know, they have some, you know, there's something that resonates about that. I mean, I wouldn't go away from the win-win story completely, because I think in the end, money talks, and we have the legacy of this capitalist system that we can't just boot out, right? I mean, this is not going to work. People will object. So it's about what can we change, and how much transformation do we need while the business can still somehow survive as a unit, right? But my perception is that for those companies that are making strides, they are willing to forego a certain amount of profit, right? I mean, they won't go completely into bankruptcy, of course, but they are willing to forego a certain amount of profit for the purpose of achieving sustainability. And this is also the narrative, at least in Europe, that I'm hearing a little bit from companies that I work with directly. Like, okay, we know that if we have to make our showers more sustainable, you know, maybe we can't have the same growth goal anymore, right? We have to sort of think about maybe we have a 6% margin instead of a 10% margin, and we can relax that a little bit, and our shareholders will still be happy as long as we tell them why we're doing it this way. There's that, you know. On the other hand, I mean, maybe new forms of incorporation are important. There's a lot of discussion on that as well, right? Also at the EGOS conference about, you know, what is the alternative to capitalism? Is the B corporation the answer to this, right? Where they have a dual goal, not just a for-profit goal, but also a social and environmental mandate. You know, and getting B Corp certification is not easy, and it gets harder every year. So, you know, but many companies are going down that path. Yeah, I think there are interesting questions to ask, right? Yeah.
Oh, yeah, Daniel, go ahead.
Yes, thanks very much, Ulrich. I tried to type my question into the Q&A, but because I'm on this side of the webinar, I couldn't do that. So I'm going to abuse my position and just ask directly.
All right.
First comment just on the ethical issues. I think they're really important, but they are sort of complex. And you know, your issue on the you know, trophy hunting and how people disagree with that reminded me a little bit of, I think, what's happening at the moment also in other discussions on technology and AI, for example, where, you know, something like the concept of fairness, people would agree at a high level, but, you know, once you start giving an interpretation, then, you know, you quickly run into problems again. And that is where different ethical theories, I think, like utilitarianism and rule morality, etc., can help. But they also end up with very different solutions, and that adds to the complexity. But my question, Judith, really goes back to one of your very first slides, and I just want to explore that sort of definition of governance a little bit that you used. So I come from a background mostly working and reading and talking about governance within Commonwealth countries. Where the Cadbury definition of governance as a system of both directing and control was the prevalent one, and also in some of my, you know, teaching formally, sort of going to great lengths to explain to people that it's not only about control, that there's also a strategic component in terms of performance. And then also that there's some underlying ethical principles like accountability and transparency. You mentioned sort of mostly control, if I'm correct, and my guess is, and this is where I would love to hear your views, is, you know, in terms of the global differences that we have, would it be fair to say, there's the word fair again, but that within sort of a European continental context, perhaps, you know, some of those issues around ethical issues, inclusivity, sustainability, have been more implicit in the way in which businesses have been run for many years, and perhaps even regulated and codified in different ways than it would be in Commonwealth countries. And of course, the US would be completely different again. How would you, at a very high level, you know, explain the difference in definitions of governance used around the world?
I mean, yeah, you know, I think the definition I use is a classic academic one for agency theory, basically, right? So I think it's a very narrow definition, and that was my starting point back then, you know, because that was what corporate governance scholars looked at, you know. But of course, I think from a pragmatic perspective, businesses take a much broader view. There are the 5 or 6 or 7 principles of good governance, depending on who you read. You know, certainly in the Commonwealth, there are these principles like transparency and accountability and so on, and consistency. And I think they matter too, but they've largely, even though sustainability frameworks like the GRI claim to include these concepts, they've largely been left behind. And this is an interesting thing in a new research project that we're looking at how companies set climate targets over time, right? So the external evaluations of companies and how they're rated on sustainability is typically in one-time snapshot. So for this year, to say, oh yeah, company's doing great. They set a goal, you know, it's an ambitious goal. We say it's fantastic, you know, and they're moving towards it. But we've discovered in our research that when you backtrack, you know, 11 or 12 years and see what goals were companies setting then, and did they actually achieve any of these goals? And how did the goal setting change over time? We see a ton of inconsistency. So more than half of the climate goals or the climate targets are inconsistent. And this has enormous implications, you know, ethical or otherwise. I mean, number one, if you just abandon your goal or change it randomly, you know, you are actually not living up to the good governance obligations, right, and principles that exist because you've set the goal, but now you don't live up to your promise, right? So I think this is actually a really critical question. And I don't know if there's, I mean, of course, there's cultural variation across different continents, across different countries. I would hesitate to say that the sort of, you know, continental European companies are doing the best. I mean, maybe, but I don't know. You know, I think a lot of things go on behind closed doors that nobody ever hears about or knows about until way too late. And then often it's just swept under the carpet conveniently, or some, you know, backdoor deal is made. I mean, Credit Suisse just collapsed like 2 weekends or a weekend ago. And the whole system swept in over the weekend and fixed the problem. You know, I mean, you kind of wonder, like, okay, number one, how did this happen over the weekend before the markets opened? And UBS somehow seems to have enough money to take over Credit Suisse, you know, and these are massive companies. But also, you know, what does that mean from a governance perspective? You know, who's now paying the price for this, you know, ill management of the company? And yeah, I'm just not convinced that we're there yet. And I think it's hard to measure, and I think it's hard to control from the outside. So when you're talking about control, and coming back to your question of sort of guidance or strategy, right? I think at least traditionally in corporate governance, boards have been very hands-off, right? They just accept that the management sets the strategy and they rubber stamp it. But this is changing. I think this is changing with some of these crises that have come along. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much, Judith. That was like a very, very interesting insight in your research, but also your practice. I immediately hand over to Daniel that he can close on time.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, we try and wrap this up also, always within the hour. And Judith, thank you so much. I think what a wonderful way to end our 3rd season of the Trinity Business Ethics Speaker Series. It was a wonderful way to end. I won't sort of spend time to reflect too much, but I want to pay tribute to my two colleagues, Max Schormeyer and Kenneth Silver. We, in the dark days of lockdown, long before we even met in person, we were in Zoom meetings trying to think about things that we could do. And it was Max's idea originally to say, let's start the speaker series. And we kicked off with Ed Freeman in October 2020. And since then, more than 3,000 people have either attended meetings or watched back the recordings. So we were really very happy about the series. We thinking of ways to advance and change and perhaps improve in future. Of course, now we're competing with post-COVID distractions again and many other things that people are doing.
Yeah.
But it was wonderful to have you. Thank you so much. Thank you to our audience. Ulrich, thanks very much for moderating. I get a sense that most people are extremely busy and stressed out this time of term. So I wish everyone well over what remains of this term. And I hope you get some rest and proper research done during the summer. And we will be in touch again towards the end of this year or the beginning of the next academic year with the season for 2023-24. So once again, from my side, thank you very much and goodbye, everyone.